Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us tonight at DePaul Art Museum for this roundtable on the work of Iñigo Manglano-Ovalle. My name is Ionit Behar, and I'm the curator here at DPAM. It's been a true honor to work with Iñigo on his exhibition, A Want for Nothing, and to bring together this amazing group of thinkers to reflect on his practice. Before we begin, I'd like to thank all our partners who made this evening possible. DePaul's Department of Philosophy, History of Art and Architecture, Environmental Science and Studies, the Institute for Nature and Culture, and the Humanities Center, as well as Northwestern University's Department of Art Theory and Practice, and UIC's Department of Art. And thank you also to Colectivo Multipolar, Sandra and Jonathan, for recording tonight's event, which will be available online soon. I'd appreciate also if you could take a moment and silence your phones. A couple of logistical notes before we begin. Tonight's event will consist of short presentations by each of our speakers, Sean Kirkland, Relyea, and Michelle Grabner, followed by a group discussion that will include Iñigo himself, and we'll conclude with a brief Q&A. I also want to acknowledge that Hannah Higgins was originally scheduled to join us this evening, but due to personal reasons, she's unable to be here. We send our warm regards and hope to welcome her on another occasion. Let me briefly introduce our speakers, and I want to thank the three of you in advance for your generosity and attention. Sean Kirkland is an associate professor of philosophy at DePaul University. His research focuses on ancient Greek philosophy, phenomenology, and political thought, exploring how philosophical traditions shape our understanding of being, ethics, and perception. Relyea is an associate professor in the Department of Art History and Practice at Northwestern University. A noted critic and scholar, he has written extensively on contemporary art, artistic labor, and the institutional and technological frameworks that shape cultural production today. And Michelle Grabner is a professor in the Painting and Drawing Department at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and co-director of the Suburban and the Poor Farm, two influential artist-run spaces. As an artist, writer, and curator, her work engages with questions of process, pedagogy, and community. And before turning things over, I'd like to share a few remarks going back several years. I first encountered Iñigo's work over a decade ago when I was a grad student in art history at SAIC. Mary Jane Jacob was organizing a symposium on socially engaged art, and that's when I learned about Iñigo's early project, Street Level Youth Video, from 1993, which he's often described as a turning point in his practice. The project was a collaboration between two artists, a teacher, and a group of teens from a Westtown high school here in Chicago, in a predominantly Latinx neighborhood. Together, they created an installation showing, during a block party, about 40 videos documenting daily life, from gangs and families to gentrification. The community's response was so strong that it led to founding Street Level Youth Media in 1995, one of the first US nonprofits to offer media and tech training to urban youth. What really struck me about the project, and something Iñigo himself often highlights, is that the electricity powering those videos literally came from people's homes. The cords ran from private spaces into the public street, connecting the community in both a symbolic and also a very physical way. And of course, Iñigo's formal sensibility was there from the start when he noticed that the extension cords were not orange. And he stopped and said, they have to be orange. That attention to detail, the insistence that form carries meaning, is something I'd love to come back later in our conversation. That symposium that I mentioned at SAIC about social practice was a precursor to this exhibition that I also saw in 2014, where Iñigo showed and contributed this work called 7,000 Quarts After Boys. The work consisted of 7 quarts of firewood laid out in a minimalist row, as you see here, along the windows of what used to be Sullivan Galleries, overlooking State Street. Iñigo's work directly referenced Joseph Woy's monumental 7,000 Oaks, a project that he began in 1982 at Documenta 7 in Kassel. It was an urban reforestation that meant to heal the scars of the war through this collective action and environmental repair. For Iñigo, Boyce is particularly significant as the first artist he encountered who made truly environmental work and who integrated the communal process into the making of the work itself. The notion that a project could unfold collectively, drawing on social and ecological networks rather than being a singular artistic gesture, has informed much of Iñigo's practice ever since. And here Iñigo reimagined Boy's gesture for our time, transforming it into a meditation on labor, energy, and the cycles of care, and how to sustain both human and ecological systems. And I see many correlations between these works, 7,000 Quarts, and the works we see in the exhibition downstairs. There is a turn to the studio rather than the post-studio in the exhibition, which was already present in the 7,000 Quarts, with an emphasis on the labor of the artist. Even if the labor involved cutting a lot of wood, that would either be valued as art or utilized to make fire. Here is an invitation to consider 7,000 Quarts alongside Iñigo's bucket titled An Attempt to Say Something That Can Actually Hold Water, a work that exists in many versions. And as Iñigo himself will say, both gestures are very simple. So simple that are, in his own words, so basic, and yet profoundly grounded in reality, because at the end of the day, you do need wood to make a bucket. With that, I'd like to welcome our speakers and thank you to Iñigo for making this conversation possible.
Hello.
I know, as if what we're about to say isn't going to sound pretentious enough already without the use of microphones. So what we plan to do is talk about Iñigo's work in terms of utility and systems, and also nothing, which is a word featured in the title of the exhibition. So utility, useful objects, is perhaps foregrounded more in the first gallery with the benches and the bucket and the chair. And systems, you could think is more foregrounded in the other two galleries with the water pump and the ballot boxes. So we're going to start there and let that take us to nothing. So you can think of utilities and systems as overlapping at the point of activity in terms of, like, say, the ordered determination of activity in a system designed for desired outcomes. And so the pump, the water pump in the main big gallery can be thought of as an object, a machine that is part of a system to extract water from the ecosystem below, that includes the aquifer, and the system above, which is the extracting and distribution of water. So let me just say something really quickly about that piece downstairs. The pump, its title, it includes the geographical location coordinates of DePaul University. And, whoops. This is pretty much what Iñigo does when he's producing, installing, and exhibiting wells. This is a also non-functioning well that he showed at his LA gallery in 2015. And it also includes the geographic coordinates for that gallery in Santa Monica. But here you can see all that water on the wall and in the room. It has a separate title, which includes the geographic coordinates for that gallery, and yet preceded by the word Poe, which is the Tewa word for water. And that's because the indigenous people who speak Tewa, they belong to 6 of the 19 Pueblo communities in New Mexico. And one of those communities, Santa Clara Pueblo, was where Iñigo built his first functioning well a year before. And so all that water was trucked from the well in Santa Clara Pueblo, New Mexico, all the way. It's 500 gallons of water trucked to the LA gallery. And this might kind of put you in mind of issues like how water scarcity is a big issue, and especially Southern and Central California. Drought is historically common, and the state now kind of buys and diverts water from other parts of the country to address the demand, especially in terms of agriculture in the state. And this brings up an important note, which is Iñigo should, as if you need a reminding after what Ionit showed us, is part of a generation of artists who kind of came up in the later 80s, who problematized the idea of site-specific art by approaching site as not a kind of geographical given or a kind of transparent envelope in which to place objects and perform actions, but it is an in-process construction, social construction that is mediated and maintained politically, but also through representation, discourses, practices on the level of society, culture, and so on. And that it is always contested. There are various communities and constituencies that are in play when it comes to any given site, so it is unstable. Anyways, saying that, you could say that then the well that preceded this one a year before in the Santa Clara Pueblo, that entails issues of, say, forced land seizure, and the fact that access to the groundwater is determined in part by who owns the land above it. Iñigo then makes another functioning well in South Chicago, or not the city, the south side of Chicago, which would then kind of, be kind of entering a situation that includes issues like the fact that water bills in the city have gone up, they've more than doubled in the last 15 years, and they continue to rise, and that paying your water bills takes up 10% on the average for low-income houses in Chicago. And none of that is even mentioning that water became a tradable asset on Wall Street just 5 years ago. Okay, so, hi, Sean.
Hi. Hey.
Sorry, it took a while to get. So I put out there's these wells that Iñigo kind of makes, installs. Some are functioning, some are not functioning. That's one thing. And then there are the kind of more main official water issues and politics that they kind of come in contact with. And these are two really different things.
Yeah.
Right? So maybe turn it over to you to talk about the difference, what's going on one side, what's going on the other.
Sure. Yeah, I feel like the philosophical contribution is going to seem utterly unmoored from reality at this point after listening that Lane's got so many facts and all that. So Lane and I were thinking about the way that we've talked a lot about this and the way that Iñigo's works do seem to interact with and intervene upon systems, and this specifically the well sort of invoking that underwater water system, but also then connecting it to a system of human use and a human system that allows humans to access that water. And so we started thinking more and more about that connection, or its that feature of systematicity. And I couldn't help but sort of put Iñigo's works then in the context of what I see to be a kind of a trend in that is central and maybe an organizing trend in 20th century continental thought, and that's something like being highly suspicious and indeed resistant to the long-standing Western philosophical and scientific tendency toward totalization. That is, it seems like there's a basic posture toward the world that either claims to achieve or at least aspires to achieve total or complete or exhaustive illumination, rational explanation, and ultimately mastery of the world. The model of knowing and controlling the world that presents itself to us totally and without remainder. And so if there's a general kind of trajectory in 20th century continental thinking that I see as sort of opposing that long-standing traditional tendency. And one strand of that opposition we can find in the phenomenological tradition. So this would be connecting figures from, say, Nietzsche and Husserl to some extent, but then through Martin Heidegger, then Sartre, de Beauvoir, Derrida, Irigaray, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, even up to Fanon, Sarah Ahmed, Adriana Cabrero, a kind of phenomenological tradition of just being suspicious of the claim to systematically map, illuminate, and organize the world that we experience. And this phenomenological trajectory, I think, begins with, in some sense, beings as they are first appearing to us in our pre-philosophical everyday experience. And then it tries to push us, so that's the phenomena of phenomenology begins with the way beings appear to us initially. And then it tries to push us to consider and incorporate into our thinking and our being in the world a kind of awareness of the dynamic ground of those beings appearing as they do, the historical, cultural, linguistic, and systemic structures that cause the world to emerge into view in our own experience from a register that is beneath those structures, as it were, and is a register not yet organized by the systemic structures. And then this tradition asks us to imagine beings as appearing as entities that are then legible, identifiable, and exhaustively knowable and masterable according to the logic of any given system. So that's sort of this phenomenological trend, I think, in 20th century continental thought. And so it seems that we could think then along with Heidegger, and this is a thinker that Iñigo sometimes references, for instance, in his 2013-2020 work, Die Hütte, or The Hut, with Heidegger, we think that distinction between what appears according to a given system's structuring and the underlying conditions for that appearing, Heidegger articulates that as the distinction between beings, the things that appear in any given system and have a value and function within that system, and being, where being is the excessive, self-occluding event of those things' emergence into view, which makes being, for Heidegger, a kind of not being. Can we go to the quote? A kind of nothing, even. So here you see Heidegger's articulation in a 1929 essay, What is Metaphysics? This kind of thinking of being as something that is in excess of any given system, in excess of the system that organizes the world as it appears to us. And what Heidegger remarks there, he says, what is remarkable is that precisely in the way scientific man secures to himself what is most properly his, the object of science, right? In so doing, the scientist always speaks of something different than the knowable objects of science. He says, what should be examined are beings only. This is the voice of the scientist speaking, right? What should be examined are beings only, and besides that, nothing, right? Beings alone, and further, nothing. Solely beings, and beyond that, nothing, right? Then Heidegger asks and intervenes in this sort of way of thinking, well, what about this nothing? The nothing is rejected precisely by science, given up as a nullity. Against it, science now must reassert its seriousness and soberness of mind, insisting that it is concerned solely with beings. So when I first heard the title of the exhibition, I did think that this allowed us, this tradition and this tendency of problematizing systemic structures that allow beings to appear in a certain way, precisely insofar as what exceeds the system is rejected as nothing or is excluded as nothing. I think the title of the exhibition really gives us, it presents itself now in with a kind of ambiguity. On the one hand, a want for nothing is sort of not a contentment, but a not desiring anything else, not desiring anything additional, not continuing to desire something more. But on the other hand, a want for nothing is, in this context, a want for a relationship to that which exceeds the system, that which is in excess of the system and is never legible or intelligible or identifiable within the logic of the system, but nonetheless is the source and the ground of that system. And so I think maybe that's a good place to go back to you, Lane, and talk.
Yeah, so kind of keeping it with water, you know, when I read this, one of the first things that came to mind was, you know, the image of kids on a hot day kind of opening up a fire hydrant and kind of, you know, basking in and playing with under the water, which, you know, is not a nothing. It's there, but it is a nothing in the sense that we would, in the context of the world we live in, look at it as charming, as innocent and weightless, which is to say, dismissing it as insignificant and not important, right? And that way it's kind of nothing. But right. So my question back to you is, so that would be like maybe the water systems that service or, you know, control water distribution in LA or Chicago or New Mexico, that would be part of this kind of, you know, totalizing, kind of ordering and making accountable and so on beings in the world. Where do, and you've told me this before, that's why I want to ask it as a question, where are Iñigo's like wells in relationship to that, or any of his other works?
Sure, yeah. So I kind of feel like what we find Iñigo doing with respect to these systems, we've talked about it so many times, this kind of invoking the system, interacting with the system, intervening in the system, disrupting the system, but that sort of various systems, political, we'll talk about that a little later, but practical, right, systems of exchange, systems of use, meteorological, right, geological, and all that. It always seems to me that Iñigo's works often situate themselves kind of playfully at the boundary of, or at the threshold of those systems. Yeah. And they insist on suggesting the effective and sort of seamless functioning of the system, and then suggesting also a kind of disruption of that. And so it seems like that ambivalence is really important to their effect, or to how we receive them.
Right. Okay. So let me give you some examples of the ways that Iñigo will disrupt something, or position something in a playful relationship with another thing. So there is the disrupting of a useful object by rendering it useless, taking a chair and tilting it against the wall, right? Or even taking a functional well and placing it in a gallery. So there's that Duchampian element of, finding a utilitarian object out in the world and then disrupting its usefulness by placing it in the art context. Because now it's not an object that serves an aim beyond it. It, as a work of art, is an end in itself. And it would be demeaning to it as art to sit on it. And it would also break institutional rules and come too close to insurance problems. But here, vice versa, this is number 2. Iñigo will go out and take a work of art and convert it or reconceive it as a functional object. In this case, Walter de Maria's vertical earth kilometer, right, which is a brass rod about 2 inches in diameter and a kilometer in length, which is sunk into the ground in this place in Germany. So reconceived now as a functioning well. So he goes the other way. Yeah, we got that already, Lane. I don't have an image of this one, but the third mode Iñigo will use is he will give an object a purpose that is different from its original designated purpose. As when, for one example, he took a Tijuana bullfight stadium and repurposed it as a humongous satellite dish that probed the skies for aliens. Okay? And then fourth, Iñigo will take up a system that has already been disrupted, like the ballot boxes downstairs that were disrupted by the Wisconsin Supreme Court decision that prohibited their use. Okay, so to just kind of stay with this for a second, this is an instance of Iñigo's often kind of like playing with recent art history and kind of like trying to put the pieces into the, new interesting dialogues with one another. So he's reconceiving the Walter de Maria, but we also have downstairs, again, not only this kind of Duchampian move that we're so familiar with, we also have one-ton prop House of Cards by Richard Serra, which the title of the larger project involving the ballot boxes is half-ton box. And that, of course, now, especially now that they're combined to make 1 ton, is a direct reference to Serra's work. We know that Richard Serra kind of critiques and supersedes, it's said to critique and supersede static minimalist objects by making sculpture that is based in time, that is creating ongoing activity through the propping, and the fact that propping is what is making possible this particular configuration. The same with this, right? So he's putting kind of, in a way, Duchamp and Sarah into conversation. He uses one to pose questions to the other. We can think of it as Sarah is putting the question of ongoing activity to Duchamp's object. What would be the ongoing activity? Or you could say the cycle of use that this utilitarian object would be part of. That would be where you're in a home, you have bottles, you take the bottles and you get them filled with water or wine, you drink the water or wine. Once it's empty, you wash them and you put them on a bottle rack to dry so that you can take them once again to get filled with water and wine. And vice versa, what would be the utility of Richard Serra's ongoing activity, right? And here the answer seems to be, well, here ongoing activity does not serve an aim beyond itself. It becomes as a work of art, an end in itself. Okay, so that seems like a pretty tidy dichotomy. Art's like, end in itself, and the non-art objects' usefulness, serving an aim beyond itself. But then he goes out and makes a functioning well that's not in a gallery, but in the real world, right? So it's like a position against those two positions. Nice. So I want to ask you, what is the status of the working well out in New Mexico or the south side of Chicago? Yeah,
I love that description, Lynn, you've given there, and I think there's. Can we put the next quote, the Horkheimer-Adorno quote? So one of the things, it seems to me that especially when Lane was talking me through the kind of dynamism and the temporality of one-ton prop and thinking about that, and then looking at Iñigo's works, referencing that with the, I love that interpretation. It really clarified so much for me. And I was thinking about maybe the way in which Iñigo's works inhabit that kind of liminal space and playfully kind of insist on that indeterminacy between in the system and in excess of or disruption of the system in the system. And I wondered if maybe there isn't something similar going on, that there's a kind of dynamism there that's in that refusal of categorization. So if you look at the Horkheimer quote, bless you, there's a kind of a place where Horkheimer-Adorno, so this is in, I realize dialectic of enlightenment, right? They're tracing this long developing process of rationalization, rational explanation of the natural world, the disenchantment of the rational world, the leaving a mythical perspective behind and an increasingly scientifically grounded understanding of the world. And they're wondering, why didn't this produce the wonders that we expected, the great technological advances with all the improvements in justice and the elimination of human mystery, and why, in fact, in the 20th century did that very logic produce such, as they call it, barbarism, right? And so they're kind of tracing the unfolding and the increasing sort of mastery of that Enlightenment thinking, that totalizing efficacy. And then they kind of, it's a pretty dark story that they're telling. But at the end, they do kind of have a couple of pages where they reference art as having a kind of power that I think is surprising. And what they say there is, and this would belong then to the other kind of trajectory in 20th century thought that's still anti-totalitarian, and that would be the trajectory, not the phenomenological one, but sort of the trajectory coming out of, say, Hegel and Marx through critical theory in the 20th century, which is also problematizing this, not any given specific system only, but the tendency toward totalization itself that seems to belong to every system we've been familiar with or generated up to the 20th century. So, and what Horkheimer-Adorno observed there about the work of art, they say, and this may be utterly naive and not interesting for people that actually know art. But for me as a philosopher, I found it fascinating. But they say the work of art has something in common with enchantment, right? And this is what struck me in relation to Iñigo's works. It posits its own self-enclosed area, which is withdrawn from the context of profane existence. The idea that in order to be a work of art and present itself to a work of art, it has to sort of section itself off from the region of the world that is exhaustively organized and ever more mastered by Enlightenment rationalization and scientific explanation. So by sort of sectioning off this space, it accomplishes itself as a work of art. It says every work of art has to describe its own circumference, which closes it off from actuality. And the work of art, through that duplication, it serves as what they call the expression of mana, right? This sort of magical animating power in the natural world that myth was able to point to, and this constitutes its aura. So it seems to me that maybe there's a way in which Iñigo's works do that in a kind of dynamic way without settling into simply a static and settled definition, but sort of draw that boundary by presenting themselves as works of art, but then also sort of erase that boundary even as they present themselves.
Yeah, it's really great because it is, at least in my experience, or thinking about, the functioning wells that, you would have to think about. They function, and so therefore, I don't know how you talk about aesthetic semblance, but their very functioning is the aesthetic semblance of a working well, right? They still have that aspect to them, because when you bring the 500 gallons of water from New Mexico to Santa Monica, it's still on a certain level a symbolic gesture, right? You're not solving the problems of water supply and shortage in Los Angeles by doing that. And so it's interesting that you have a case of, it's functioning, but the functioning, somewhat like form in a painting, is still kind of shadowing the main official functioning in its vicinity, rather than trying to supplant it or rival it or something like that. That's just not the case.
Yeah. I love that notion of shadowing the function, the form doing that.
Yeah. So going along with that, because we have to wrap up. Yep. Okay. So then we have the ballot boxes.
Right.
Okay. So like the bucket, if it had a bottom, or the 384 gallons of water that are contained within the glass gallon containers, and I counted it, in the big room downstairs, the ballot boxes also receive, hold, like a bucket or a gallon bottle, and when the time comes, they dispense the votes for tallying. Right, so they have a kind of function that's at least formally similar to the buckets and the other containers in the show. Here, though, my question to Sean is, these don't kind of stand challenging nature and mastering nature. So what is the status of the ballot box as they distill a system that in this case is the way by which elections are held? In other words, are they still about mastery, or is this actually about not mastery and kind of like totalization as foreclosing any alternatives, but actually a possibility of change, changing things.
Right. Yeah, that's really great. And so I'll just say one. Maybe we could go to the Marcuse quote. So we've gone from 1929 Heidegger, 1944 Dialectic of Enlightenment, now 1964 Marcuse. So this arc of the 20th century, and there we get this kind of commentary on totalitarian thinking and totalitarianism as a feature of not just a kind of oppressive and violent political structure, but a kind of tendency of thought, right? A non-terroristic economic technical coordination which operates through manipulation of needs and vested interests. So it seems to me that there's a way in which that kind of, as you said, that distilling of the system through highlighting a kind of dysfunction is a way to sort of suggest that tendency of the system to operate in a totalizing way, to incorporate every hint of resistance or an alternative, and to successfully incorporate or sort of eliminate any real sense for, or any real impulse for social change, and so that kind of function, that way in which the work comments on the political system, I think actually is able to sort of mirror that tendency toward totalization without then suggesting an alternative or something like that, which would be.
Yeah, which is very Iñigo, is not to kind of like, make it easy on anybody to figure it out, or that he's figured out. I just want to we have to get off the stage and make room, but I just wanted to make one last point very briefly. These don't function, even though they're out in the world and they have all of the physical properties of the actual ballot boxes. Because to function, the ballot boxes have to have instructions on them, right? For voters. 2, they have to be amenable to being deployed and then recollected, given whatever the election calendar is, and they have to be placed at a time and at a location as spelled out to the public within the rules of whatever counties are running the show, right? So these don't have instructions, A. They are a half ton, so they are very not amenable to being dispensed and picked back up, and they appear at times and locations that are completely arbitrary. And we were just talking about, they kind of seem like ghosts that way, like they have this kind of blank visage because the instructions aren't on them. They're monochrome. And yet that's kind of compensated by and then some by their intense weight, right? Their presence as very, very heavy objects. And finally, if the functioning wells shadow the official wells through their function, you can think of the ballot boxes in their dysfunction shadowing the dysfunctional role of ballot boxes in Wisconsin. Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Thank you all. It's really an honor to be here. And Iñigo, really exceptional exhibition. Okay, I'm here this evening to offer you a more localized and artist perspective on Iñigo's exhibition and his work. Iñigo and his longtime Chicago, Wisconsin home base have profoundly impacted my own studio practice and my thinking for many, many decades. As a young artist, his impact on me started in the late 80s. When he was supporting emerging artists while working at Chicago's influential Randolph Street Gallery. And then there was, of course, Mary Jane Jacobs' landmark exhibition, Culture in Action. It included Iñigo's much celebrated street-level video project. Here on the screen is a still from The Kiss, a 12-minute video dating from 1999. I encountered this work at the Institute of Visual Arts at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee before it was featured in the 2000 Whitney Biennial. A quick summary for those who haven't viewed it. It stars Mee Vanderoe's Farnsworth House in Plano, Illinois, and a window washer who repeatedly renders the home's glass facade opaque with soap bubbles before restoring it to the transparency of a squeaky squeegee. Over many decades, Iñigo's work has offered me and culture at large new understandings on how form, politics, architecture, and materiality can refigure modernism, its tropes and its vocabularies, while always nipping and shaping at its trajectories. In addition, Iñigo was also a leading figure in art's relational turn here in Chicago. Work defined by a set of practices that place human relationships at its core. Today, he continues his inquiry into social and spatial structures while asking additional questions related to the handmade and the utility of artworks. And I'm eager to hear more from Iñigo this evening about the arcs of his work, the cultural contexts that have shaped it, and his keen interest in the material presence of the objects, and especially what can happen when those objects betray or complicate their function. This past year, the Poor Farm, an exhibition space and residency that I run with my husband, artist Brad Killam in rural Wisconsin, featured Iñigo's work alongside works by Felix Gonzalez Torres and Caterina Grossa. Here's Felix's work. Caterina. Felix again on the inside. And Iñigo's installation. This Poor Farm exhibition situated these three artists' work within the troubling historical social context of the American poor farm system, highlighting the legacy of institutional care, the societal attitudes towards poverty, labor, and the visceral forms of human necessity. Okay, so this past year, I have leaned heavily into object making. Given my invitation to work at Kohler Company's pottery division, Iñigo's exhibition here at DePaul is an important check on my own thinking. Like Iñigo, I'm drawn to the ways in which commonplace arrangements derive from materials and everyday routines. They can reveal power structures embedded in labor, temporal rhythms, and the banality of domestic and institutional life. My rearticulations, particularly those that foreground janitorial, custodial, and maintenance motifs, bring into focus unacknowledged and neglected systems of order. And as we know, order is never neutral. It is always political. In its most prosaic and cliched motifs, there lies the potential to expose entrenched social hierarchies. My own interests lie not in generating new forms, but in translating the familiar, reframing everyday objects so as to undermine rather than reinforce the mechanisms of unseen power. Iñigo's work has always exaggerated and exasperated this critical tension. Keeping his thinking and his work close keeps me honest. Through his practice, I can identify my own shortcomings, as Iñigo's work is always grounded in precision and intellect. It's attuned to the human and political dimensions of form and function, and importantly, very importantly, always resisting the seduction of transactional exchange. And quickly, here's a current work, a collaborative work that I do with my husband, Brad Killam, installed outside the U.S. Pavilion at the Architectural Biennale in Venice. It is in direct dialogue with Iñigo's burnt ash bancos. We too are asking questions of utility and invention. When I read Iñigo's quote stating, "When I create a metaphor, I want to create it in the most banal, efficient way," I realized that I was hearing something that no other contemporary artist would dare say. After spending copious amounts of time in his exhibition, critically and even poetically, relishing in its vast metaphorical potential of the works on view, I realized this statement is intentionally overstated by Iñigo and maybe overplayed, and that cheeky reflexivity continues to be a critical strategy for him. Okay, moving on to the work. As we know, the impetus for these 3/4-inch raw steel plate voting boxes is a response to a recent Wisconsin court ruling outlawing voting via absentee boxes. They are a rusty resemblance to a piece of public street furniture. They possess no markings, signage, or instructions. One of the ballot boxes in the exhibition was previously anchored to the sidewalk at the entrance to the Suburban in Milwaukee's Walker Point neighborhood. Iñigo's recumbent boxes are unambiguously an indictment on minimalism and the minimalist practice of elevating institutional form and its material transcendence. Iñigo's boxes instead relish in the force of gravity and excessive weight. And while the steel boxes display no structural fatigue, the choreography of masses becomes a manifest metaphor on the slow, cumulative collapse of democratic institutions under its own neglect. And like Breuer's Whitney Museum and its heavy concrete massing and controlled apertures, Inigo's boxes are also fortress-like geometries, albeit purposefully ubiquitous. While Breuer's design was a protective vessel for the avant-garde and a pointed critique of neighborhood elitism, it has fared well. Now home to Sotheby's, it has become the new icon for the art trade. Voting boxes, like mailboxes and phone booths, are enclosures of trust. They mediate between private intention and public circulation. These public boxes are conduits to collective institutional systems, threshold objects, poised between sender and receiver, between presence and absence. Their generic forms mirror the bureaucratic and invisible networks of structured civic life. To place a ballot or even a piece of mail into a box is to enact trust in a system, to surrender individual agency to collective governance. It's a symbol of both empowerment and erasure. One's singular voice disappears into the aggregation of many. All of these sorts of boxes share a similar formal logic of containment and mediation. Each is a portal device, an interface between the individual and the collective, between interior and exterior, between the private and the public. And in pop culture, the street box is even a motif for time travel. In situ, these objects are rooted, their locations predictable. Their attachment to the street is immobile and unyielding. For this exhibition, Inigo uproots their stability. While we may nostalgically long for these predictable static forms and their democratic implications, today we must also navigate a different sort of form, one that situates bodies meaningfully amid movements, displacement, and change, especially in the wake of immigration, hybridity, and globalization. Inigo's boxes allude to this as well. Positioned like lovers with feet at one end, these two unmoored pieces of street furniture now convey literally a tonnage of vulnerability. Here, Inigo's boxes commingle Felix Gonzalez Torres's attachment to intimacy with Richard Serra's commanding quartet abstractions. Like Felix Gonzalez Torres's indexed bodies, Inigo's boxes also suggest a shared presence, transforming a civic loss into a universal gesture of human connection. And it's also difficult to resist seeing the graffiti tags as tattoos now. An attempt to say something that can't actually hold water. It may be a title of a work, but it is also a reflexive claim that rings loud in our current cultural context that is all too rife with transactional and declarative meaning. An attempt to say something that can actually hold water acknowledges both the difficulty of making meaningful work and culture's persistent need to lock down and transact meaning via language. Inigo at one point said something very familiar, that making art allowed him to speak without saying something, like making a bucket without an ability to hold water, or discovering a windsock that can't catch the wind. In The Thing, Martin Heidegger uses the example of a jug to explore what it means for something to be a thing. He argues that the essence of a jug is not found in its materiality, its clay, form, or shape, but in the function of holding and pouring. The jug's thingness arises from its emptiness, which allows it to contain and to give. The thingness of Inigo's bucket is not in question. To not have a bottom suggests a different purpose, for a bucket or for a jug, a purpose as necessary as holding water. Without a bottom, its craft and materiality are exceedingly foregrounded. The primary question Iñigo is asking about his well work is, what if a gesture becomes utility? I want to pose an adjacent question. Can utility also create an aesthetic, rare experience? I am thinking here about the properties of water. Despite the geoengineering of Iñigo's functioning wells and the project's vast social and environmental implications, the presentation of the work in this exhibition is also producing surprising moments of rarity and wonder. Instances that stand apart from our ordinary engagement with water as a necessity for life. In the many gallons of water on display, each refracting full spectrums of light and casting moving, trembling shadows. Can one find moments of intense singularity? Can the work suspend our habitual perception of water shaped by our human dependency on it? And can we get to these questions through the orderly, repetitive organization of his presentation? And then there is the affected inclusion of that white cloth, hanging on the pump handle high above our heads, out of reach, but the only tactile interface between hand and pump, wet and dry. In the benchworks, De Maria's The Vertical Earth Kilometer is referenced in a single circular leg end at the bottom of an upside-down bench. The forms that delineate the ends or feet of Iñigo's benches and chair legs is the form that gives structure to the installation. These end legs or feet can be understood as the forms that structure the installation, and they afford the installation its networked and implications and its rhythmic qualities. In Iñigo's chairs and benches, the legs are not just attached, but bored into the furniture's planar elements. Because of their traditional craftsmanship, predictability and utility in Iñigo's furniture is secure. Regardless of the defamiliarization of the object's spatial orientation. Here, variation and disruption coexists with the stable qualities of craft, tradition, and function. Finally, the title of the exhibition, I Want for Nothing. It has a distinct Dickensian overtone. They want for nothing, yet are always wanting. In Dickens' words, the saying is a paradox, possessing yet remaining unfulfilled. Iñigo's title, I Want for Nothing, is a critical plea and an urgent practice. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentations and your thoughts. Incredible and very different responses. But I want to make sure, Iñigo, that we also hear from you. Yes. But I can get us started with a question. And I'd love for Iñigo, you to start. Yes? With my question? Okay. So I'm curious about the spiritual and the contemplative side of your practice, Iñigo. I think there's something really spiritual in the making of the work and also on the presentation of the work. There's this meditative quality in the repetition, the patience of the labor, and even the quietness of some of the projects, right? Especially of the well project. Iñigo, how do you think about that aspect, and do you see that spiritual dimension in your process? And I want to also mention a couple of earlier works of yours from the 2000s that we often talked about. So one would be Sonambulo, right? And that, for those of you who don't know, and maybe you can explain it better, but it's this sound work you made that is that you made in order to help you sleep, right? So it had this kind of self-care aspect to it, and there's much more to it, but very simply I'll describe it that way. And then there's this other early project about creating this sort of spa in a gallery place with a floating tank and this kind of sensory deprivation tank called El Niño effect, where people had to go there in pairs and have this experience in the gallery space. So there's another example of this kind of self-care aspect. But what I'm pointing to here is like, okay, we have those examples, but then what's different in terms of those with the self-care aspect to these works that we see downstairs, that I characterize perhaps much more as spiritual or even monk-like type of work. And finally, and then I want to hear from you to name that the work that's downstairs that reads, and it's also titled "The Poverty of an Object is Its Strength," which is it's kind of paraphrasing Thomas Merton, right? A monk, a poet, and a social activist, among many things that you've read, and then made this work sort of in response to that. So I'd love for you to speak about that aspect, please.
All right. Thank you. I'd like to thank everybody for saying the things they said. How's that? And am I on? Okay. Now I'm on. All right. So I want to thank Ionit for working with me for close to 2 years in a number of discussions with a very reticent artist who actually did not want to do a show, to actually doing a show. And then I want to thank Lane and Sean for interesting discussions prior to this and homework that I was given by both of them, right? And then, of course, there's a lot that's downstairs. I think Michelle and her partner, Brad Killam, have sort of offered me the opportunity to present work in a reclusive spot, which is the Poor Farm, which was important for me, in a kind of a place, right, where my vulnerability would feel safe. And then also for allowing me to kickstart the half-ton project. And but to go to the question, right, which is a question that, wow, that's a question I didn't expect. And the question that, I don't want to get. And yet, because Ionit knows the work and has come to know how I work, there is a kind of something underlying it. And there is something that has shifted over the decades to include a kind of notion of spirituality, even when one immerses oneself in the study of phenomenology and philosophy. So I think the title itself was something that came from a conversation that Ionit and I were having at the moment, where we're considering whether to have the exhibition, right? And I said, well, Ionit, I really want for nothing. But what I really want is to want nothing. And it's just a conversation that we're having. I'm explaining to her where I think I am and what I think my project might be, even outside of art, just as a person at this point in my life, right? And then it comes up months later, it comes to, we're titling the exhibition. And so we have a series of titles. And then we throw those out, and then we make another series of titles, or Ionit brings me a series of titles. And many of them are immediately, it's like, no, no, no. And then at the very bottom, Ionit has inserted a portion of that conversation, and it says, a wand for nothing. And I responded almost immediately, and I said, that's it. Let's do that one, right? Because there is, as you said, a kind of ambiguity of that. But there is, for example, today when I was reading a very heavy text on Heidegger that you provided, the homework I was given, right? Where Heidegger tries to describe what metaphysics is, and he instructs his students that the way we're going to do this is that we're going to consider this question, what is nothing? Or what about the nothing, right? And so to me, in answer to that, I think in answer to what Heidegger is getting at is, for me at least, that it's not a nullification. It's not a nothing or a no thing, right? But it's something that underlies the ground of maybe perhaps being, right? That in other words, that there is, in considering existing or being, or what Heidegger would call das Sein, which is another translation of existence, but literally being there, right? That in order to even ponder that, we are always pivoting away from nothing, right? That existence always carries with it then the nothing. And so, when I'm reading this stuff, it's, for me, it is almost, a spiritual, for a very content agnostic and once a Catholic atheist, it is very, very spiritual to read that. And so I think of some of the things that are going on in the exhibition. And as you say, that one work, which used to be just a note in the studio to myself, which was the poverty of an object is its strength, was pulled from the gallery, from being a note to becoming a work by virtue of another author, another hand, which is the curator, saying, and what about this? Would you consider this, right? And so suddenly a thought or an utterance or a re-paraphrasing of Thomas Merton's, because Thomas Merton is talking to young monks, right? And he knows it's hard for them because they have committed themselves to a vow of poverty. So he's talking to them and he's explaining, trying to convince them that actually it is the poverty that is the strength of the spiritual program. I'm going on and on beyond what you asked, so I'll stop there. Does anybody want to follow up with that?
Yes, I do. Yes. So Iñigo, with that, as you can tell from my presentation, I can go on and on, formally interpreting everything you put in front of me. But what I haven't touched on, and maybe you are starting to touch on that, and that is the treatment, the burning of wood. What does that do? How does that protect wood, preserve wood? What is that in terms of a relationship to fire? I'm just wondering if you can use that as a practice in terms of what you're thinking about.
Well, it's a known thing for me because I have to do a lot of fires around my studio. And I have the hut that you referenced in the exhibition. That sculpture is 2 large cubes that are completely charred. And that's a kind of very meditative process by which that charring occurs. So I'm thinking about the exhibition. I know I want to put out the benches. I know that I think some of you have talked about, there is something about like the work, and Ionit and I would talk about this, that things are broken, and it's not literal things are broken, but things are broken. That I'm in a moment where I'm contemplating, yeah, that things are broken. And therefore, I want to acknowledge that, right? And so the ballot boxes are dumped. The well is inaccessible. The bucket has a hole. You can't sit in the chair. And then the benches, which are part of a kind of a spiritual process of making. It's a very simple bench, a stake bench. It's been produced across cultures for thousands of years. It requires no hardware, a kind of just making, and it's a process, it's a repetitive process, right? It's almost like a grid process, and the process, and then it comes to a point of where, how am I going to finish them? What do I put on them, right? And I thought, initially I was testing black stains in paint because that's what I've done with other furniture-like work in exhibitions. But then I just kind of go back to the fact that, when I'm not in the shop burning, I'm out cutting wood, invasive species, and then having to burn that. So I'm got really good at burning. And so I said, okay, why not burn them? Just char them. And so out of that comes that. There is a link in that work to the 7,000 chords, which itself was about banking, right? Banking carbon or using carbon or the carbon that's in the wood and can be released, about certain values that we assign to exchange and to holding and then to releasing or consuming, right? But the bancos here are in a kind of position of potentiality or broken down. In other words, they're pushed aside. You can't sit on them. They're not ready to be used. They're not inviting themselves to be used, but they are a kind of a potential. Right. So there's a kind of potentiality with them. Yeah.
Maybe one more question for all of us, and then we'll open up, and hopefully there's more comments and questions. And Lane and Sean, please feel free to also chime in this one. But I love to bring back the example that I mentioned at the beginning with my introduction of the 90s project here in Chicago, the Street Level Youth Video Project, and hopefully connected to the Well Project. And if we could talk about the bridge that you're connecting between the private and public space with both of those projects, with the, as I mentioned, with the Street Level Youth Project, specifically connecting people's homes' electricity into the street, literally into the street level. So how do you see, Iñigo, those two projects speaking to each other? If you, the Well Project and the Street Level Youth Video. And if you could also speak about the negotiations that you go through specifically with the Well Project when you're installing them in the Sonoran Desert and having multiple conversations with different constituents in order to be allowed to place them, even though they're only tests for now.
It's kind of interesting. In other words, a public placement of an ordinary object in space, one the well and the other one a monitor, milk crates, and extension cords with something coming out of it. Both involved years of negotiation before they would actually happen. And so the well is a very humble object, right, that doesn't have the theater of street level video, also doesn't depend on displaying actors, but includes actors, right? Or the potential for actors. I mean, that's one shift, right? That happens with it. But I mean, I think that what I wanted to say, for me, what's really important about the wells as prototypes is that they're anticipating a permanent well in the Sonoran Desert. That is a project. That is where that is going. So in order to do that, I am walking and investigating the terrain, its histories and its communities, its politics, its geography, its aquifers. And each photograph and each location refers to different layers of eco-political, social, cultural systems. And I carry with me 3 maps. One is a map of parcels and ownership where I can look at where I'm standing, who owns this, and what is its history. Then the other one is a map of groundwater and aquifers that includes nearby wells, so I can actually figure out what the state of the aquifers are and the potentiality for a well. And the third map I carry is one by the Humane Borders, which is a group of activists assisting refugees crossing the border, and collaboration with the Pima County Coroner. And that map tells me sites of mortalities, deaths in the desert by migrants, of migrants rather, which in most cases involve dehydration or some sort of incapability of sustenance, right? And so each photograph is citing one of those areas, right, where someone has passed. But it also might be citing too an issue of public-private debate of ownership and also ecological terrain. So one photograph refers to sites where leopards are crossing, or pumas are crossing between, jaguars, I should say, are crossing between Mexico and the US, or maybe no longer crossing because of the wall. So there's this complicated system. But in the end, what you have is a very humble object that in its potentiality would maybe provide only a drop in the bucket of what is the problem of water in the desert. But on the other hand, wants to present itself totally anonymously and totally as a banal object within the profane space. I mean, you were talking about art, and I'm going, yeah, well, my art actually is always pointing to the profane existence of the object at the same time as it is presenting themselves in this other space that withdraws from that profane space. So, and it's very simple. These things for me are, if I can reduce them to the most simplest thing, a well is a well and an artwork in the desert when it functions. A well is maybe perhaps only art when it moves into a place that it doesn't function, right? Where its utility now has to be reassessed. How does it function? So, and that goes back to Sonambula, which is the thing. This was a sound audio piece that I made literally to help me fall asleep. And it was from a recording by Street Level Video of a gunshot during one of our interviews, as a drive-by. And that bullet sound, that millisecond, was converted into a meditative summer rainstorm that arrives and recedes within 11 minutes. And I did fall asleep to it, except it was a Walkman with a disc, and I forgot that it was on autoplay. So I went back to the beginning when you get the original gunshot that explodes at the beginning, and therefore it kind of failed, right? So it failed. It was something that was to be a tool for use for a desired effect, and it fails. And so in a conversation with James Rondeau, I go, well, now it can only be art because it's failed.
Can I just say something really quickly in response to that and to Michelle, your kind of poignant kind of like showing of the white cloth that hangs over the handle of the well downstairs. You know, I didn't say it because we were running out of time when I was talking about posing the question to the ready-made about suspending utility. That's another kind of ongoing activity along with propping, is suspension of utility outside of its cycles of use, its behaviors of use, its ensembles of use with other actors and objects and so on and so forth. And one of the poignancies, I know that in my conversation with people, what gets mentioned when the topic of the white cloth comes up is emphasizing that it's inaccessible, the handle's inaccessible, especially in relationship to the photographs where the handle is right there, ready to hand. I look at you because I was trying to do Heidegger. And also, the white flag of surrender comes up. But one of the poignancies I associate it with is its suspension of using, especially in relationship to the photographs of where it's ready to hand, the suspension of using the rag to wipe off dirt and wipe off sweat as you actually employ the labor to pump the water out of the well, right? And that then water would be what quenches the thirst produced by the labor to extract the water. And that kind of labor using the white cloth is a kind of like casual labor, and I want to say, like ready-to-hand labor, that is pre or non-tailorized, talking again about systems, right? Where, and like, the photograph of your studio and the hand plane and, other tools around it, which again are non-tailorized and casual, where there's a kind of, again, ensemble and behaviors and so on that come with utility.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was interesting with the white rag because the initial intent was to have this thing that could be a rag, but I would kind of fold it or present it so it would also be a flag of surrender. And that was the hardest part about that room, because we went up and down ladders changing this rag until I finally said to Ionit, I said, I think we have to dispense with the metaphor. The rag just wants to be a rag, right? And so it goes back to that very cheeky thing I always said. So I said another cheeky thing. But in a sense, there is within that a kind of note within that kind of surrender. On the one hand, it is also acknowledging labor that goes into an art installation, and not by artists, but by the whole program, and especially the people working, that there's this labor when you present art, then you have to kind of clean up the space, or you have to clean up the art to present it properly. So there's always that labor. There's the maintenance labor, how you maintain it. But there's also this notion of trying to, that all these systems, right? Even the systems that we think empower us, right? Even systems of justice, right? Systems of equality, systems of rights, systems of, survival. They all have to be maintained and not every 4 years or every cycle, but just continuously maintained. So maintenance becomes that kind of political gesture.
Love to open it up for questions, right, and comments. So I'm gonna give you the mic.
Thank you. Thank you all for animating Iñigo's work so nicely tonight. And thank you for sharing your work with us, Iñigo. So you've already brushed lightly on what I was going to ask, but I was thinking of batteries the whole time, of these physical batteries. So for storing carbon, like you said, banking carbon, like with the 7,000 oaks, and then also banking hydrogen, oxygen, in this battery with the vessels, and then also the political power in the ballot boxes. So you're banking labor, you're banking power. How do you see, if I talk about these batteries, how does that kind of factor into a system once it plugs in and disrupts it?
I mean, for me, I think I'll go back to this potentiality, right? That's what you're pointing at. I was thinking, like, for example, I was thinking of something in the homework that you gave me on Heidegger. There's one part that says, for the most part, we seek only when we have, and then I'll insert, already anticipated the thing that we're seeking. And what he's talking about here is that when we look forward to potential, we have to already be able to envision that thing that we don't have yet, right? Mm-hmm. And this problematizes this relationship between existence and nothing, right? And so when you have no resources, there's this kind of nothing. But in the systems that we're talking about here, material systems such as carbon and water, right? We know that these are cycled through all the time. I speak about in the wells, you are as much the battery in the well. Mm-hmm. You will take a drink, right? And you will then give it back. Mm-hmm. And at some point, someone else will take a drink, and there will be maybe, perhaps, a part of what you gave back that they take in. And the same thing happens with carbon as a cycle, a thing that exists and it can't break down, but it just recycles itself. Now, how do we play into that system, right? And I think that when you're talking to me, I'd like to have both everybody else's input into. I think it's a very good question, that there are these systems that are created by a kind of, I'll talk about, Western thought or continent that try to structure and control these systems. And then there are these systems that exist as a source, right? And so water for me becomes really important because at some point it's determined, right, that water is not ours. At some point, right? When you bring up the issue of access to water, you are then sort of bringing up the preclusion of access to that water. Who holds that water? What are the water rights, right? Interestingly enough, in the desert, I had a conversation with a rancher who actually is very conservative politically and really wants to shut down the border like completely. He says, but on all my cattle troughs, I have a fountain because I don't want people dying in my ranch. I don't want them dying in the desert. So he puts it up and I go, yeah, that's why I came to talk to you. I heard you did that. And he goes, but you know what? It's my water and I choose to share it. And then I'm talking to the director of legal policy, environmental legal policy at ASU. And she tells me, well, actually, that's totally wrong, right? It is not his water, right? Groundwater is not his water. Groundwater functions like a deer running through your lot. It's not your deer, even though it's running through your lot. Water is underneath ground in Arizona law, right? And so it becomes a kind of a battery that is owned as a kind of commons, right? But the insertion of another system, in this case, plumbing, boom, the well itself is a system of ownership. So now it's the conduit is what he owns. The access to water through this system is what he owns. And so, I mean, it's an interesting question about this kind of things operating as batteries. And I look to it as kind of potentials, like potentiality, right? And also, I think, look for ways to access the potentiality of things that are not in, not in the known systemic process. And one thing you're familiar with in your own work is the gift, right? So the gift operates outside of a system of capitalism, right? And it's millennial. The gift is millennial in terms of the stranger and the host, this exchange between the stranger and host. And it was kind of developed in at least in Western thought, in Western thought, this notion, and for me, this is important because I'm always thinking about migration and peoples and the stranger and the movement of peoples. The word guest and host are, what do they call it? There's a linguistic word for description of words that have the same source. They're the same source. And at one time, the word for guest and the word for host was exactly the same. They operated that way. And it was totally necessary in a culture where everybody was moving and had to move. And I would say we're still in that culture, but we've broken down that system, that original system of hospitality, which also comes from the word guest, which also comes from the word host. We've broken down the system of hospitality. So, that's great.
Thank you.
Thank you. I love the way that your work puts pressure, like it has like a sharp arrow quality to contemplate severity. And it has, I think, well, I've spent time in New Mexico and I've had students that never had fresh water. And that was a learning curve for me because my experience with that was the Flint, Michigan story first. It wasn't knowing that Indigenous people have never had clean water in New Mexico. And so to have that heightened awareness when you transport that system of water from people who have not to a system who recently have not in LA. And you see, I love how the arrow points for us to think about sharing and the severity of these systems that are severely policed in terms of economy and access. Like why hasn't there been wells placed before your well? I love what your work is doing. And thank you for creating the contemplative space here with us to think about resources. My question is basic in terms of making. When or how do you decide to create that cheekiness in terms of truncating the form? I just want to know your process of thinking creatively and where you decide to sharpen that arrow, like to put the rust on, to leave it out long enough to create a tag. I want to know a little bit more about the creative process, because we've talked a lot about meaning and whatnot.
Well, I think that's something that Michelle can answer as well too. Maybe it would be really interesting. How do you go about that? Because I think you truncate stuff. I mean, I received as a gift, right, from Michelle this brown, sort of like neutral brown. It's kind of like brown, doorstop, which would be rubber, except it's ceramic, right? And then this other sort of, it's almost like a dishcloth, a folded dishcloth, hairy and textured, but it's ceramic, And so there's this truncation that occurs with transferring the work from one material that truncates its utility, but then opens it up to a kind of very different function. Yeah, I think, and then when Lane was talking about that specific prop or the prop, the stela, sort of the artwork for its own sake, right? There is that, but I think sometimes that Michelle and I are questioning, right? We're questioning that, even though the work does operate, transfers, moves towards, but it moves awkwardly to this notion of for its own sake, from the site for the sake of, right? So this is something that was really interesting to me. And in regards to Heidegger, I came across one of his students, Hannah Arendt, writing a dissertation and Heidegger was her professor. So he would be reading, and she was very influenced by Heidegger and was attending some of these lectures that were quoted. But she is writing on St. Augustine and love. This is her dissertation. And so we start to talk about love, the use of love, right? And she starts to try to figure out how St. Augustine breaks down love. And one of the things that she comes across is this notion of for the sake of, right? And for its own sake. So one is uti, Latin for use or useful, to utilize, to employ, to deploy, right? For the sake of. So you have a desire, which is love, right? And you need something to achieve that desire. And so you love. I love coffee. I love coffee. And so, but I use coffee to achieve a particular state and to sense a particular taste and fulfill something that I think is lacking in the morning, right? So I love my coffee, but it is a tool. It is for the sake of. And then she says, then there is frui, which then Latin moves to the notion of fruition, right? A kind of benefit in and of itself. And that is then for the sake of, that you love for the sake of. And you can understand where St. Augustine is coming here, because he wants to make the difference between love of things that are profane, including loving each other, and sex and all that kind of stuff, and love of God, right? And so for the sake of is caritas, right? So one is the tool and the other one is caritas, which is care, right? And I think this is like pretty sort of incredible that Hannah Arendt is negotiating this And then you read later on in Heidegger that he too is setting up this notion of being, or the Sien, being there, right? That phenomenology and being, his preoccupation with being also has a kind of utility, I think, because he wants to arrive to that place where we exist for caring in the world. He's very much attached to how we receive the world, how it erupts, and how we erupt in it, and what that relationship is, right? And so that's and sometimes as artists, you have to take the thing, and as you said, I love that word, truncate it, right? In order to then offer a different potentiality or address something other than the use of it, right?
Maybe you can talk about the bucket in relation to all of that, since speaking about the process, right? Before the bucket, there was the title, or even that sentence, right? An attempt to say something that can actually hold water. So that was first. And then came several attempts to respond to that idea. There was a bucket, right? That could, and you mastered that technique, which is very difficult, right? That traditional technique of putting the wood exactly and perfectly well so that there's no leaking. And then what?
And then after first there's a statement, and the statement is talking about a self-critique, right? That I think all artists, I would hope all artists go through, which is to think about their work and what it's really doing. And then also to think about what they say their work is doing and what it's really doing. I ask this of my students all the time. I say, look, you say this is what your work does, but your work is actually doing this. Should you now change what you say about it, or should you stop doing that and actually do something that is what it is that you're saying, right? Which is, I think, what the practice, the work of art, working on art is. So an attempt to say something that actually holds water is a response in these times of just actually understanding socially just because the problematics of truth. Where has truth gone, right? And where has fact gone? Where has something that can actually hold water hold? But then it's also individually, when I'm uttering something, even today when I'm uttering something and addressing even the question about the battery, I'm going like, well, now, does that hold water? Right? What I just said, right? And it goes to the extent of thinking whether you're bullshitting, right? You know? That sometimes the statements that I make, they have another purpose, and they might slide away from actually holding water. So they leak. And actually, when they leak is a wonderful time when a student or an audience member says, hey, wait, but, oh, you found the leak. And that's great, right? And so I said, okay, well, let me contemplate this idea of let me attempt to say something that actually holds water, which is a metaphor, right? So let me make the literal metaphor. Let me make the bucket. Let me literally hold water. And so I go about learning how to make wooden buckets until I finally achieve one that actually holds water. And then I look at it and I go, okay. And then I say, well, there's something that needs to be done here that just moves it somewhere else, which is now to release that object, that vessel that you were talking about, from actually holding itself. So it then operates in a different way. It has a different utility. And maybe perhaps one of the things it refers to is my personal impossibility of actually saying something. That even in all these attempts that I fail, right? In holding water. And maybe I'm failing right now in that, right as I speak. But that's what's really, I think there's something, I want Sean to say something here. I want all of us to say something here, because I think, I think, like, for example, I think there's something about taking a mop, a dust mop, and casting it in cast iron that is a truncation. And there's an achievement, but there's an implied kind of failure to the system that occurs there. I want you to address that. And then, Sean and Lane, Sean, there's this moment in Heidegger where he talks about the hammer. So I think that's been part of our discussion, right? When we realize the hammer, right? So I don't know. Do you want to say something?
Go ahead, Sean.
Sure. I'll make it quick. I think there's a the idea of a mop in cast iron. I do think Heidegger's understanding of the thing. Michelle, you mentioned the thing essay in your discussion. I think one of the things that strikes me as true, not being an artist, but just experiencing works of art. Heidegger suggests that all things have the kind of emptiness at their core that is sort of foregrounded in a jug. That is, everything that exists, we tend to think of things as existing in this sort of self-identical, persisting way, right? It is the same through time. It's equal to itself through time. And as long as that's true, it exists. So it's sort of, we think of things existing as a kind of static occurrence. Things exist as present. They're just present there and available before us. And one of Heidegger's things I think that's really radical is he tries to get us to think of the thing as not a static presence, but as an event of emergence. So everything that exists, the book, the microphone, all of us, we exist not as sort of static present through time, but as sort of emerging out of non-being into being at every moment. And the challenge of trying to think this kind of dynamic ontology where everything is a constant sort of event of self-presentation rather than static sort of persistence, and imagining a world that you experience that way, what it does is it indexes everything you experience to a kind of ground, to a source. One of the things Iñigo says in an interview about the Well project in this 2015 interview, or they came out in the catalog, the Well catalog. You say one of the key points of the work is the fact that the well itself points to a source beneath you. So I think this idea that everything is grounded in this source and emerges out of a source, and trying to experience a world where things exist through that process of emergence. I think what Heidegger wants to say is that's true of every single just mundane object in the world, but we notice it when it's a work of art. Like a work of art foregrounds that emergent character. I experience the work of art as emerging before me and presenting itself in a way that I don't with a water bottle and the microphone, et cetera. And I wonder if artists, if that resonates with the way artists think of their work, either presenting themselves to an audience or in the process of creation. But I do think of that kind of the idea that the peculiarity or the peculiar power of a work of art is to let the viewer experience this dynamic kind of ontology of emergence for a moment.
He wonders if artists.
No.
You want to say something?
Yeah, I don't think I'm going to answer the question, but maybe it answers a couple questions. And I think this speaks to the limitations of the work that I was showing you, the slip cast porcelain janitorial work. And yes, I can frame it up politically who does that work, right? We can understand that as kind of a political location who does the janitorial work. And, then the translation of those objects into ceramics, we can think about what that material translation means. But I was really curious about the slide that both of you showed with Duchamp and Serra, right? And then I throw in Felix Gonzalez-Torres. There's a really interesting triangulation that is happening in your work that I can't achieve. I mean, this speaks to Iñigo's thinking and that kind of movement that he has. And that is really striking to me right now that, those, your boxes, your voting boxes can, speak to, again, the crisis of democracy and also speak to, the vulnerability of bodies within that system. And that is by composition and organization that you chose. So anyways, I guess I'm answering that question and feeling, and again, this is why Iñigo continues to teach me, is I really profoundly see my own limitations, my material limitations, my limitations in terms of what subject I take on as such.
Well, I want to follow up on that and actually not speak about the limitations of Michelle's work, but how it might work, right? So the crazy thing about Heidegger and this emergence of these objects all over the place is that this is happening all the time. And, how do we live in the world, right? So one of the symptoms of schizophrenia is that we can't block out all the sensory information happening to us. So if we were able to actually acknowledge the eruption of all of beings, all of things in the world coming into being, we would be fucking nuts, right? So we don't. So they come from a ground, they erupt like we erupt, right? But Heidegger says that's why you can use a hammer without thinking about it. But when the hammer breaks, suddenly you notice the hammer. That's when you notice the hammer. Right? When it breaks. And so I think like Michelle's work, right? There is a break. There is a rupture. When the thing moves from its utilitarian materiality into another materiality that renders it not useful, you are breaking that thing. And then that thing becomes noticed. But not only that, when you move it into the art context, what actually happens is that thing becomes noticed, and therefore you notice all the things like it that it refers to, right? So now the artwork, which is, right, rendering the thing dysfunctional, actually opens up the true functionality of the real things out there. And that's what makes that work, right? Cause us to focus on, and for the moment, concentrate on this notion of labor and maintenance and the worker and utility. It happens by first disrupting and breaking it. It becomes essential to do that. And that's called, now I will call it truncation from now on.
But I just want to kind of just point out that you do it differently. And you did it differently with the latest work, which is, you can think of the Duchamp, which is truncated when he takes it out of circulation and puts it in an art gallery or museum now, as a truncation. You can think of the truncating the usability of your bucket that now allows it to be contemplated for its form and texture in a kind of normative way of appreciating artworks, right? You don't need to read it back to use. You know what I'm saying? Like once it's truncated, you force it to be read back to use because you make functioning wells and things like that. And I totally just have to say, I love what you said, Michelle, because yeah, the ballot boxes point both, like at Felix Gonzalez-Torres, to the public sphere, and they point right back at the Richard Serra and say, let's think about the nothings that we can take the Richard Serras in terms of suspension of, or kind of, activity suspended from any aims that could, because that's exactly what the ballot boxes are. When they're stacked on top of each other, when they're not dispersed in Wisconsin geographically, you have suspended the use of the ballot boxes, right? And that becomes an activity. We all feel the constant time, the temporality of the suspension of activity. We are about to have lots of activities potentially suspended, right? I mean, that's the moment we're living in. And it also, I think, gives, again, the water pump handle being suspended or kind of suspended in its inaccessibility, like that's really great poignancy.
I know there's a lot of more questions and comments, but unless there's any other sort of final thoughts, we're going to say very much thank you, Iñigo. Thank you, all of you. Thanks, all of you, for showing up. Thank you.